Charlotte, for that report. What a beautiful day it looked like there in Paris. And picking up on the protest, our next guest wrote an opinion editorial recently, and he makes the case that domestic political movements in industrialized nations should do more to empower impoverished masses to take charge of their own future in order to end hunger and reduce inequality. Joel Berg, the CEO of Hunger-Free America and author of America, We Need to Talk, a self-help book for the nation, joins us now. Hey, Joel, good to see you. Thank you for being here in studio.
Oh, my pleasure, Bart.
So let's look at this. You talk about inequality in your opinion editorial, and sort of as a touchstone for inequality, you point to hunger,
yes,
and you say that's getting worse and worse, not just in the U.S., but a lot of places in the industrialized world and other places. And then you say that there's been a shift from public funding, dating back in the U.S. to Ronald Reagan, but to private funding, and that hasn't worked out so well. Explain it.
Charity's fine, and we've all worked on efforts to increase the amount of food donated in America, but that's not a substitute for jobs, living wages, and a serious safety net. I tell foreigners, you know, if you want to follow America's lead, follow us on jazz, follow us on basketball, follow us on the First Amendment, but for goodness sakes, don't follow us on social policy.
And that's what they did, right? I mean, when Reagan came in, he did all these things. He, President, for all the good that he did, and he did some good, and the wall came down, et cetera, end of the Cold War, but he made this shift back to the states. Block grant, community development block grant, cut low-income assistance, and all of those things you would think not really a great model, didn't work out. You quote some crazy figures about the number of food banks in the U.S. that increased, yes, but then other nations adopted it, like the UK, right?
Yes, and around the globe, people are actually modeling their charity assistance based on the United States. They're literally taking floor plans from U.S. charities. Now, again, charity in a vacuum is fine, but when David Cameron in the UK announced his so-called big society, it was just like Reaganism Redux or the points of light that the Bushes pushed, cutting social programs, not engaging in policies that created jobs and increased wages. And what happened? Child poverty in the UK shot up for all of the faults of the previous Labour government, and I didn't agree with them on their international policies, but they dramatically reduced child poverty in the UK, and then the Conservatives come in and they exploded again. I do not know why the world is following our worst example.
So the metrics really speak to themselves, and you point out in this great opinion editorial that shifting to the private sector, which, you know, has its place, as you say, but the numbers really have gone down. And there are more food banks. We may have a chart on this in industrialized countries than there's ever been before, taking the U.S. example. And so these metrics that it's getting worse means that something has to be done, right?
Absolutely, and we know what works. In the same way we know what causes climate change, and we know what can solve it, and there are people paid a lot of money to lie about it and say, oh, the science isn't clear. It's exactly the same with poverty and hunger. We know, no shock, if you have more money to buy food, you can get food. Particularly, we're talking industrialized countries, which have amazing agricultural abundance. So there's no mystery about what reduces hunger in industrialized countries. Make sure that people who are working earn enough to feed their families, and when they have disabilities, when they're children, when they're senior citizens, when they're temporarily unemployed, make sure there's a safety net big enough to buy them food. And by the way, this isn't only good for poor people, it's good for the economy as a whole. Any economy that has such a significant portion of the economy who can't afford to buy the basic goods and services of that economy is going to flounder in the long run. And it's about national security. No superpower in the history of the world has remained a superpower if it's failed to feed its own people. So if you want to ignore the Quran, ignore the Old Testament, ignore the New Testament, ignore every civil, ethical tradition that says we have to fight hunger, if you're just a selfish capitalist, then you ought to end hunger, and you ought to have higher wages, more jobs, and a safety net, because it's good for you.
I couldn't agree more with you. One of the things that I enjoyed about your opinion editorial was you went back and gave some history that I'd forgotten, quite frankly. Part of it was back to Martin Luther King and the war on poverty, and that was really a citizens' movement that changed from Nixon denying things. Is that sort of movement We saw it then. We're seeing it with the yellow vest now. Is that what you think needs to happen to change policies?
Absolutely. When I tell people, oh, we can end hunger in the United States, we almost did in the 1970s, they look at me like I'm crazy. But just look at the marriage equity movement. No matter what you think of the morality of it, I happen to be for marriage equity, but no matter what you think, they changed American society, and they changed the way our laws work because they empowered the people most affected, empowered gay and lesbian people to speak out on their own behalf. We need to empower low-income people to be leaders in the movement. We need to convince middle-class people that's in their self-interest, and we need to isolate and discredit peacefully and democratically the people on the other side who stand for policies that increase hunger. So empower the masses, convince the people who are undecided, and then defeat the opposition, and that's what we need to do. It's simple.
Reduce inequality. Joel Berg, thank you for the great work that you do, my friend. It's an honor to know you and have worked with you in the past.
Thank you, Bart.